March 31st, 1776. Future First Lady Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband, founding father John Adams, making a plea to him and the Continental Congress to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Yes, that was about 250 years ago, and ironically, still seems to resonate in the 21st century. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look at the struggle and the fight that women have had to undertake in modern times for their own fundamental rights. At the outset, my apologies for this change in topic than the one intended for today's program. But the recent developments at the highest court of the land necessitated that we talk about this before anything else. Ironically, in ancient times, under civilizations like those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India, women enjoyed almost the same rights as men. But towards the medieval times, the gap between the rights of men and women started increasing, partly because of some of the influence from the religious scriptures, and partly also because of the structure of society in general. And as we started moving towards the 18th and the 19th centuries, the awareness of the gap between the rights of men and women started becoming more obvious, as reflected in the letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams. One of the first highlights and challenges to this gap happened in 1792 when the English writer and philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft penned a widely distributed treatise entitled A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, in which she argued that women were not naturally inferior to men, but rather lacked education. The essay suggested that women needed to have equal access to co-educational schooling and that women's participation in society was essential to any nation's well-being. In the United States, the first convention on women's rights was held in Seneca Falls, New York, in July of 1848. And this convention is credited to have launched the women's suffrage movement, which ultimately led to women getting the right to vote in 1920. So what were the core issues the organizers of the convention were trying to raise? Let us look at the opening remarks, which covered the goals and purpose of the convention from one of its organizers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and in case of separation, the children of her love. Yes, you heard it right. Women at that time did not have the right to their own wages, which were deemed to be belonging to their husbands. So in light of all these issues, the convention came up with a list of 11 resolutions which aimed at treating women at par with men. So in summary, what these resolutions stated was that any laws that placed women in an inferior position to men had no force or authority. women needed to have equal rights within the church and equal access to jobs. Out of the 11 resolution, the ninth resolution ended up being the most controversial. Why? Because it called women to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. In other words, the right to vote. The press picked it up as well. The New York Tribune, while it was skeptical of giving women the right to vote, nevertheless argued that if one were to go by the Constitution, women needed to have equal rights. Interestingly, though, the US Constitution does not guarantee women the same rights and protections as men. Surprised? Yeah. It contains no explicit protection against discrimination on the basis of sex or gender. We will get into more detail on this topic a little later in the program. So, what are the key areas of discrimination that women have been fighting against to be on par with men? These vary across the world, from very basic fundamental rights like the right to education to the more discriminatory ones in the advanced countries like equal employment and equal pay. Almost 2/3 of the world's illiterate adults are women. So education is still a distant dream for women in certain parts of the world. Then there is the freedom of movement. Yes, you heard it right. In a few countries around the globe, women are not allowed to leave the home without a male guardian. And in some countries, you have to seek permission from the male family member for several things, including international travel. As recently as August of 2019, Saudi Arabia ended the male guardianship laws allowing women to travel by themselves. And then there is the struggle with equal access to employment and salary. And this has varied quite a bit across the globe. For example, in British Hong Kong, up to the early 1970s, women had their job status changed from permanent to temporary employees once they got married. And as a result, they lost all pension benefits. And in many European countries, France up to 1965 and Spain up to 1975, women could not work without the consent of their husbands. And then there is the issue with property rights. That is, women losing their right to their own property once they got married. And as we saw earlier, this was one of the issues raised during the Seneca Falls Convention. The key fight, though, was for the right to vote. And subsequent to the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton teamed up with Susan B. Anthony and formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. And its charter was to coordinate the suffrage movement at the national level. And in 1890, the group teamed with the American Women's Suffrage Association to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Another event of note, though, is that the territory of Wyoming, which ended up becoming the 44th state admitted to the Union, became, in December of 1869, the first American state to allow women the right to vote. At the national level, though, it would still be another 50 years before women would get the right to vote. But it was notable that as far early as 1869, Wyoming had granted women the right to vote. But in 1893, New Zealand became the first country in the world to grant the right to vote to women. Yes, 1893, the world had the first nation granting women the right to vote, and it was New Zealand. How did that happen? Well, a key differentiator was that besides all the suffrage movement in New Zealand, a big chunk of the male population sided with the women. So men were in full support for giving women the right to vote. That was the key element in New Zealand becoming the first country to give the right to vote to women. And unfortunately, even today, in the chambers of the US Congress, that element seems to be missing. So, as the women's suffrage movement gained more traction in the United States, members of Congress introduced a constitutional amendment enshrining women's right to vote in 1878. But it would take decades of protests for it to even move within Congress. In 1918, President Woodrow Wilson started supporting women's suffrage, but members of the National Women's Party thought that he wasn't using his influence enough to sway the last two senators needed for an amendment to pass. So what did the activists do? They started burning Wilson's speeches outside public buildings, implying that he was a hypocrite for not doing more. The amendment passed a few months later. But for an amendment to become law, it needs to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And in 1920, there were 48 states in the Union. That meant 36 had to ratify the amendment. Initially, the outlook appeared bleak, but Tennessee ended up tipping the balance in favor of ratification when a young 23-year-old Republican representative, Harry T. Byrne, cast the deciding vote that made Tennessee the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And what made Harry Byrne vote in favor of the amendment? Reportedly, a letter from his mother which said, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." The amendment was certified on August 26, 1920, and women in every state in the US were then able to vote in the elections that November. So women in the United States got the right to vote. But the US Constitution, as I indicated earlier in the program, still did not prevent discrimination on the basis of gender. So in 1923, Alice Paul, a women's rights activist and founder of the National Women's Party, started fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment, which, if added to the Constitution, would make it illegal to discriminate on the basis of gender. The amendment was proposed in every Congress from 1923 to 1972 when it finally passed. But it fell 3 states short of being officially added to the Constitution. So as we speak, the US Constitution still does not guarantee equal rights to women. Another area of concern with respect to equality between men and women is healthcare. Health is defined by the WHO as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And across the globe, discrimination against women occurs through denial of medical services that are only needed by women. And as a result, the maternal death accounts for about 300,000 per year. Maternal death meaning deaths occurring in women during the course of pregnancy or childbirth. And one of the key factors in prevention of maternal deaths is access to birth control, be it contraceptions or access to safe abortion. In October of 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. It was located in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and her clinic was deemed illegal under the Comstock laws forbidding birth control. She had to close the clinic within 10 days. But Margaret Sanger went on to establish the American Birth Control League in 1921, the precursor to today's Planned Parenthood. And then, in 1960, science and technology brought forth one item that would go a long way in empowering women. In May of 1960, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, approved the first commercially produced birth control pill in the world. And this allowed women to control when and if they wanted to have children. And as usual, when women get empowered, the male world feels threatened. Organized religions such as the Roman Catholic Church stood firm on their principles that artificial contraceptives were sinful. And many states prohibited the sale of contraceptives, even to married couples. And then, in a landmark decision in 1965, the Supreme Court, in the case Griswold versus Connecticut, ruled that such laws were unconstitutional. The court determined that a fundamental right to privacy existed between the lines of the Constitution. Laws prohibiting contraceptives violated this sacred right. And the ban of prohibitive laws was extended to unmarried couples in 1972, and a federal judge imparted the right to purchase contraceptives to unmarried minors in 1974. And the next aim was taken at laws that restricted abortion. Incidentally, the criminalization of abortion did not result from moral outrage. The laws against abortion, which came about around the late 19th century, came from the newly established physicians' trade organization, the American Medical Association. Yes, it was the doctors who decided that abortion practitioners were unwanted competition and went about eliminating that competition. And to ensure success, they took help of the Catholic Church. And then, almost 100 years later, in 1973, the Supreme Court heard the case of the anonymous Jane Roe, an unmarried Texas mother who claimed that the state violated her constitutional rights by banning the practice of abortion. By a 7-2 vote, the court agreed and declared that the Constitution protects the woman's right to abortion. But unfortunately, in less than 50 years, the court seems to be poised to make an about turn with respect to that ruling. So, what factors lead to women empowerment and equality with men when it comes to fundamental rights? Well, when it comes to evaluating the gender equality within the country, the world bodies like the World Economic Forum, United Nations, etc., usually use 4 key factors. And these are economic opportunities, education, health, and political leadership. And the countries that make it to the top 5 based on progress within these areas are Iceland, Finland, Norway, New Zealand, and Sweden. So essentially the Nordic countries and New Zealand. So what factors are leading to these 5 outperforming the rest when it comes to gender equality across the globe? Well, just looking at the data, one could say political leadership. For example, 40% of parliamentarians and ministers in Iceland are women. So we can conclude that the more women holding political office, the higher is the chance of gender equality in that region. But the next question to ask is, how are 40% of the elected representatives ending up being women? The answer is the same as in New Zealand in 1893, when women first got the right to vote. Support and backing of men. Societies where men and women are well educated and forward thinking do not have any biases with respect to gender equality. And as a result, you see a lot of parity in fundamental rights across genders and other sections of society as well. And this gap in forward thinking could not be more visible in the composition of the US Supreme Court. And on that note, we conclude this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Who were the first three signatories to the agreement to form the Commonwealth of Independent States post breakup of the Soviet Union? The Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS, had its origins on December 8, 1991, when the elected leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement forming a new association to replace the crumbling Soviet Union. So the answer is D, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Question for the current episode. Which nation's Supreme Court in 1928 ruled that women were not persons, so they were ineligible for appointment to the Senate? Was it A, the United States, B, the United Kingdom, C, Canada, or D, Australia? Once again, which nation's Supreme Court in 1928 ruled that women were not persons, so they were ineligible for appointment to the Senate? Was it A, the United States, B, the United Kingdom, C, Canada, or D, Australia? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in today's episode. In the next episode, we travel into the economic history of the world and trace the history of the global supply chain, the initial challenges, and the current state. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.